AR-15. The AR-15 traces to Eugene Stoner's Armalite lineage in the United States, with Colt commercializing the design for civilians after military adoption of the M16 family. Its cultural footprint became unusually large for a semi-automatic rifle, framed by industry as the modular modern sporting rifle even as it became a touchstone in policy debates. The platform's two-receiver architecture and standardized interfaces seeded an ecosystem of parts, calibers, and configurations that few rifles approached. Gas operation with a rotating bolt gives the rifle its familiar manners, whether through Stoner's internal gas architecture or short-stroke piston revisions in some variants. Detachable box magazines, a straight-line stock, and optics-ready receivers make the rifle highly adaptable. Caliber options extend from .223 Remington/5, 56x45 NATO to 6.5 mm Grendel, 7.62x39 and rimfire or pistol caliber conversions, sustained by an aftermarket that treats the upper receiver as a quick change module. Restrictions grew from feature definitions rather than select fire capability. The United States enacted the 1994 Federal Assault Weapons Ban, which limited production of specified semi-automatic rifles with enumerated features until the law sunset in 2004. Australia's 1996 National Firearms Agreement moved semi-automatic rifles into a tightly controlled category after Port Arthur. New Zealand's 2019 reforms following Christchurch prohibited most semi-automatic centerfire rifles and larger magazines. Canada added the AR-15 to a federal prohibition in 2020 after the Nova Scotia murders. Several U.S. states and cities also maintain their own prohibitions or compliance frameworks. Glock Gen 3-5, Glock GS MBH of Austria drove the late 20th century shift to polymer, striker-fired service pistols, with production in Austria and the United States. The Gen 3 through Gen 5 families refined the original layout with modular backstraps, improved barrels, and optics-ready slides. Simplicity of the fire control group, corrosion-resistant finishes, and parts commonality made these pistols a global default for duty and carry. A de facto ban emerged through coordinated litigation claiming that Glock pistols are readily convertible to full auto when fitted with illegal auto-sears commonly called switches. The devices are third-party parts, often imported or 3D printed, and not manufactured or endorsed by Glock. Lawsuits by multiple blue state attorneys general and municipalities alleged manufacturer liability, despite the device's illicit nature, with filings from jurisdictions including California, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Hawaii, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, Nevada, New Jersey, New Mexico, Oregon, the District of Columbia, Chicago, and Baltimore. Under that legal pressure, Glock discontinued production and shipment of Gen 3-5 full-size and compact models effective November 30th, while leaving slimline models outside the change. A successor V-Series, shipping from December 1st, revises internal geometry such as the trigger cruciform area and rear plate interface to harden the design against conversion claims while retaining external dimensions for holster and accessory compatibility. The company maintains that conversion originates in contraband parts, not factory design. Debate coalesced around two positions. Proponents of the suits argue that any platform widely present in criminal misuse should be redesigned or restricted if small. Cheap parts can alter its function. Pro-2A advocates counter that the legal theory punishes a manufacturer for criminal acts by third parties and circumvents protections intended to block such claims. Immediate consequences include parts scarcity, as owners of legacy pistols stockpiled slides, small parts, and magazines, along with a spike in secondary market activity. Collectors show new interest in Gen 3-5 runs associated with custom frames and aftermarket slides, while agencies that standardize on Glock continue to field inventory as issued. AK-47. Mikhail Kalashnikov's Avtomat Kalashnikova of 1947 originated in the Soviet Union and spread globally through licensed and unlicensed production. The rifle's identity fused reliability, simple maintenance, and loose tolerance manufacturing that tolerated dirt and neglect. Those qualities, combined with geopolitical distribution, made the AK family a visual shorthand for revolution, insurgency, and state arsenals alike. Semi-automatic imports into the United States experienced several waves of policy friction, but the 2014 action that drove a notable shock came through sanctions rather than domestic gun law. When the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control listed Kalashnikov concern in connection with Russia's actions in Ukraine, Russian-made AK rifles became non-importable to the U.S. market. Inventory vanished quickly as buyers sought originals, leaving European and domestic AK pattern rifles to backfill demand. Stamped receiver construction, a long-stroke gas piston, and a rotating bolt define the mechanical core. The platform accepts detachable magazines of varying capacities, with military patterns designed for select fire, while most civilian versions are semi-automatic only. Variants differ by country of origin, furniture, sighting systems, and manufacturing methods, yet share compatibility across magazines and many small parts. Sanctions produced a predictable cascade first-wave sell-through, premium pricing on remaining Russian stock, and a turn to clones and parts kits. Pop culture imagery amplified the sense of urgency whenever policy touched the rifle. The episode illustrated how foreign policy tools can reshape a civilian market overnight, without changing domestic statutes about function. Thompson submachine gun. The Thompson submachine gun originated in the United States through auto ordnance, with early production runs by Colt and major wartime output by Auto Ordnance and Savage. Design work began during and just after the First World War. The first commercial model of 1921 introduced the submachine gun label to the public. The firearm's identity was forged twice, first through Prohibition-era criminal misuse and law enforcement response, and again through broad Allied service in the Second World War. Mechanically, the family moved from the friction-delayed Blish concept toward practical blowback in later forms. Early M1921 and M1928 variants carried cuts compensators, barrel fins, and drum magazine compatibility, while wartime M1 and M1A1 models simplified machining, omitted the drum, and used fixed sights to speed production. Chambering in 45 auto and cyclic rates around 600 to 900 rounds per minute defined controllability and logistics. With 20 and 30 round box magazines becoming the field standard, federal regulation in the United States arrived through the National Firearms Act of 1934, which required registration and regulated transfer of fully automatic firearms. Other countries later imposed their own prohibitions or named bans. Canada classified Thompson variants as prohibited by name in 1995. The United Kingdom placed full auto arms under Section 5 and curtailed center-fire semi-automatics in 1988. Media during the Prohibition era magnified the Thompson's association with gang crime, while wartime photography reframed it as a service arm carried by commandos, paratroopers, and military police. Civilian ownership migrated to semi-automatic replicas with closed bolt internals and longer barrels where permitted. While museum and law enforcement collections preserved historically documented examples, the combination of early Colt production, Prohibition lore, and wartime provenance keeps the Thompson at the center of collecting, even as the original role passed to lighter, cheaper designs. Uzi submachine gun. Israel's Uzi submachine gun emerged in the 1950s and became one of the most widely recognized small arms of the Cold War. The design's compact receiver, telescoping bolt, and folding stock delivered a short, overall length while keeping the mass over the grip. Open bolt operation in early select fire patterns simplified manufacturing and aided cooling, though it introduced its own handling characteristics. In U.S. law, the key restriction on fully automatic Uzis traces to the National Firearms Act framework and the 1986 prohibition on transferring newly manufactured machine guns to civilians. Importation of fully automatic arms for ordinary civilian ownership had already been curtailed by 1968, which meant the U.S. civilian market divided into pre-1986 transferable examples and later semi-automatic, closed-bolt pistols and carbines. Some states later named the Uzi in assault weapon statutes, limiting sale or transfer irrespective of NFA status. Public perception was shaped by frequent appearances in films and television and by press images of police raids. Practical carry conversations inside the community turned to controllability, deployment speed, and liability. The long-term result became predictable pre-1986 automatic receivers appreciated as scarce collectibles, while semi-auto clones and pistols offered the form factor for range use under modern rules. MAC-10. The Military Armament Corporation M10, often called the MAC-10, was an American machine pistol designed by Gordon Ingram in the 1960s and produced in the early 1970s. Compact dimensions, a telescoping bolt, and threading for the psionics suppressor defined the package, which appeared in 45 auto and 9x19 mm variants. The concept fit a niche for close-range fire with a very high cyclic rate and the option of suppression for special applications. Civilian semi-automatic versions that retained open bolt operation proved easy to convert, prompting a 1981 BATF determination that such configurations were machine guns under the National Firearms Act. That ruling ended civilian sales of open bolt semi-autos and pushed later commercial variants to closed bolt operation. The 1994 federal assault weapons ban then named semi-automatic MAC-type pistols among the restricted models for its 10-year term, citing features such as barrel threads, weight over a set threshold, and high-capacity magazines. The 1986 restriction on new automatic firearms remained in place for select fire versions. Cinema of the 1970s through the 1990s cast the MAC-type silhouette as an archetype of chaotic fire, which influenced public discussions far beyond its actual field use. After the legal clampdowns, manufacturers pivoted to cosmetically similar yet compliant variants, such as the PM11/9 and other Cobra-marked models, removing threads and limiting magazines to meet features tests. Collectors focus on early Military Armament Corporation and RPB-marked examples, while most shooters gravitate toward more controllable handguns and carbines for practical roles. Street Sweeper. Hilton Walker's revolving cylinder, 12-gauge shotguns, the Armcell Striker lineage later marketed as Protecta, and, in the United States, as the SWD Street Sweeper originated from Rhodesian and South African development. Their cultural imprint came from a combination of high capacity and a bulky drum profile that looked more like a riot control tool than a sporting arm. U.S. models included the licensed Sentinel Arms Striker 12 and lower-cost Cobra/SWD variants. The core mechanism used a 12-round cylinder advanced either by a pre-wound spring early striker or by manual means in the Protecta revision. Reloading required individual ejection and insertion of shells, a slow process that belied the platform's visual menace. Options ranged from short barrels to folding stocks. Sighting systems were simple troughs or fixed blades. In 1994, the U.S. Treasury classified the Striker 12 and SWD Street Sweeper as destructive devices under the National Firearms Act for lacking a recognized sporting purpose with a bore over half an inch. That moved them into the same registry and transfer tax system as other NFA categories, with a grace period for owners to register existing guns and criminal penalties for unregistered possession after the window closed. State law layered further limits in some jurisdictions. Press and political narratives of the early 1990s treated the Street Sweeper label as self-explanatory. Focusing on capacity and appearance, owners, armorers, and gunsmiths often observed that reloads were slow and maintenance exacting. The ruling largely relocated the design to the collector sphere, where original Armcell and licensed Sentinel examples draw interest, while modern defensive and duty roles default to conventional pumps and semi-autos. MP5. Heckler Koch's MP5 family was developed in West Germany during the 1960s and brought the roller-delayed system of the G3 rifle to a 9x19 mm submachine gun. The result paired smooth recoil with excellent accuracy for its class. A broad variant tree compact MP5K, integrally suppressed MP5 SD, and later, offerings in other calibers made the design a standard for military and police special operations worldwide. Fully automatic MP5s fall under the National Firearms Act regime in the United States, with the decisive change in 1986 ending civilian transfer of newly manufactured machine guns. That divided the market into scarce transferable pre-1986 automatic MP5s, and a larger market for semi-automatic lookalikes, including HK's SP5 pistols and domestic or imported clones assembled from parts kits. Other countries maintain their own restrictions on select fire guns, often placing them beyond ordinary civilian ownership. Operational fame arrived when British SAS teams used MP5s during the 1980 Iranian embassy siege in London. Photographs and footage of that operation, together with regular appearances in film and games, established the MP5 as the archetype of a modern submachine gun. Civilian demand persists through the SP5, the semi-auto version that mirrors the handling and ergonomics without the select fire capability. Steyr AUG. Austria's Steyr AUG Armee Universal Gewehr, adopted as the STG-77, entered service in the late 1970s as one of the first widely issued bullpup assault rifles. The design integrated a quick change barrel system, modular furniture, and an inline optic, all inside a compact overall length that retained a full-length barrel. Military patterns offered select fire operation, while civilian AUG-SA imports provided semi-automatic function. U.S. import policy in 1989 restricted foreign-made semi-automatic rifles deemed non-sporting, which included the AUG, and the 1994 federal assault weapons ban limited domestic manufacture of specified configurations until its expiration in 2004. Manufacturers and importers experimented with cosmetic revisions, thumbhole stocks, unthreaded barrels to satisfy sporting criteria. And after the AWB sunset, Steyr coordinated U.S. parts production in 2008 to supply compliant AUG variants. Later, A2/A3 receivers with Picatinny rails and optional NATO stock lowers broadened magazine choices. The layout retained a short-stroke gas piston, rotating bolt, and translucent proprietary magazines in standard 30 and 42 round capacities. In service and police roles, the bullpup's compact handling appealed to units operating in confined spaces, while civilian interest focused on the modularity and distinctive ergonomics. Long after the first import wave ended, domestic builds and licensed derivatives kept the concept current. HK G3. The Heckler Koch G3 originated in West Germany and became a mainstay of the Bundeswehr from 1959 onward, with widespread licensed production by allied and non-aligned nations. It is a 7.62 Bauer 51 mm NATO battle rifle built around roller-delayed blowback, stamped steel receivers, and simple field service through push-pin takedown. The design spun off a family of weapons, from the HK-21 machine gun to the PSG-1 precision rifle. Civilian versions in the United States were imported as the HK-91 until 1989, when federal import policy barred rifles categorized as non-sporting or paramilitary. Heckler Koch responded with modified HK-911 and SR-9 configurations that removed certain features, but later determinations expanded the feature set considered disqualifying, and imports ceased. Domestic demand shifted to licensed and unlicensed clones, notably the PTR-91 based on Portuguese tooling, as well as SR series and CTME-derived builds. Mechanically, the G3 uses fluted chambers for reliable extraction and a diopter drum rear sight. The compact trigger pack allowed armories to change between semi-automatic and select fire configurations in military service, while civilian imports incorporated receiver shelves and omitted the paddle magazine release to block automatic packs. Collectors seek out original HK imports because of the limited window and the distinct compliance variants, while modern shooters often choose clones for parts, availability, and more forgiving prices. The trajectory from HK-91 to SR-9 and then to domestic clones captures the import ban era's logic constraint by feature and origin. Then see manufacturers alter furniture and receivers to comply until definitions change again. What remains is a durable mechanical idea, kept alive by parts commonality and a large international production base. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, pass it along to your fellow gun geeks, and subscribe to catch more content like this. Got topic suggestions? Sound off in the comments. Thanks for tuning in.